This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Good morning. It's 4 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. One of the things that I puzzle over quite a lot is the frequency with which you can return to the same territory. I say you, I mean we. The frequency with which we can return to the same territory. It's only really happened twice in all the time that we've been spending our mornings together, that it has felt normal and natural to return to the same territory almost every day. The most obvious one, of course, was COVID. And it actually felt inappropriate for months to talk about anything else. And the mind was certainly focused by the fact that I was often presenting the programme from a shed at the bottom of a glorified shed, I grant you, at the bottom of my garden. The idea of doing a phone-in about anything else in those sort of circumstances just seemed weird, when the reasons why you were listening to me broadcast from a shed at the bottom of my garden were essentially the only story in town. And the other one, which was a slightly more personal perspective, was Brexit, of course. Because there were so few outlets that were telling you the truth or giving you the facts that you needed to have to develop, however you voted in 2016, post-2016, to develop informed opinions about what was actually going on, which I think is why people who were listening to this programme at that time would be the least shocked and surprised in the country by the absolute mess that has subsequently transpired. But war should be on that list, shouldn't it? I mean, obviously, wars in which we are engaged would be. I was still at school when the Falklands needed defending from that Argentinian invasion. But I imagine, and you know, there will be people listening to the programme now who can remember listening to LBC during the Falklands conflict. I presume it was the great Bob Holness and Douglas Cameron presenting the breakfast show at the time, and Brian Hayes in this slot. But I imagine that the Falklands would have demanded attention pretty much every day, wouldn't it? If British troops were engaged on the ground, you would feel a little odd drawing attention to anything else. Maybe not 3 hours a day in the way that it was during COVID, but certainly, you know, most days in the way that it was post-Brexit. And yet, in the last 6 months, we have clearly, on this programme and indeed in the UK media, we've done a lot more on the unfolding situation in Gaza, the continuing carnage being inflicted upon the Palestinian people by Benjamin Netanyahu's government and the Israeli Defense Force than we have upon the situation in Ukraine, which, and I don't want to turn it into a sort of trite game of top trumps, but I think, well, it is a nuanced debate, but for me, at least at this point in proceedings, the international ramifications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine would be, certainly in the shortest term, considerably greater for geopolitics, for the globe, than the continuing situation in Gaza. Maybe not in the long term, who knows, but in the shortest of short term, clearly the situation in Ukraine is, quotes, more important, end quotes, for international relations than the carnage in Gaza. And that's why I've put it in quotes, the word important. I'm not going to engage in any competition about which deaths matter most. But the situation in Kharkiv over the last 24 hours has been absolutely dire. 16 and a half hours spent, the longest period of time ever in Ukraine's second city, spent under aircraft attack alert, you know, sirens ringing out across the city, and a sense that the massing of Russian troops has changed the game. And this was entirely predictable. That's one of the oddest things about it. Even armchair observers, one newspaper writes today, publicly predicted an assault on Kharkiv. We even knew the units that would be involved, if you're interested in such things, the 11th and 44th Army Corps and possibly the 138th Separate Motorised Rifle Brigade of the 6th Army. And I heard on the radio this morning, I heard a question that I haven't heard asked yet, and it sent a bit of a shiver down my spine. The question was, as you might have already predicted, or as you might even expect, what if Putin wins? Now, in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine, there was an almost upbeat air of celebration at how badly the Russians had calculated. You know, the army marching up what was essentially the main road, the sort of equivalent of the the M40 coming smack into the middle of Kyiv, and just thinking that they would be able to waltz in unmolested and essentially take over, which of course they have done in other areas. And it failed miserably. Realistic reports that they thought it would all be over in 2 days, that Ukraine would sort of crumble like a wet cardboard box, and Volodymyr Zelensky would either be, either his days would end in unpleasant fashion, or he'd be fleeing for exile elsewhere in the world. And they got that completely wrong. And the pictures of ordnance vehicles with wheels missing, epic evidence everywhere of failure, stories of the troops themselves being supremely ill-equipped for the task that they'd been given. And then the detailed reporting of the toing and froing. The more Ukraine seemed to be defying the odds and repelling the Russians, the more perhaps, and I'm conscious of a little bit of guilt or shame here, embarrassment, I think, is probably the best word, the more perhaps the Western media enjoyed reporting it, and the more complicated it got, lurching ultimately into the balance or the pendulum swinging in Russia's direction, the harder it became to cover. You can do war reporting if it is, quotes, good news, end quotes, but if it's bad news, it becomes a different proposition entirely. And then, of course, the problems in Congress that Joe Biden faced in getting aid into the region, the simple calculations, the simple mathematics of running out of shells. You know, people telling us, Kira Rudik, our great friend in the Ukrainian parliament, appearing on the programme regularly to beg Western governments, as Bill Browder was doing on this show yesterday, to free up some of the frozen Russian assets held in British bank accounts and just give the money to the Ukrainians so they can actually buy the stuff that they need. Because the idea of actually running out of ammunition, not having the shells to put in the ordnance, to launch at the drones or to fire at enemy positions is extraordinary. What's happening now is that Russia is testing Ukraine along the entire length of the 800-mile front line. The army has changed. The best analysis I heard this morning involved the explanation of how the army has learned its lessons, the slightly ragtag-seeming shambles that seemed to typify Russian forces in the early days of this conflict, as I said, has been replaced by people who know what they're doing. Tobias Ellwood tried to draw attention to something really interesting earlier this week, and Twitter being Twitter, it sadly his serious point got buried under a barrage of mockery that he'd used a photoshopped picture of the new head of the military. But the new head of the military doesn't have much of a military background. He's essentially an economist, showing that Putin is now prioritizing a sort of military procurement over almost anything else, ensuring that his army is equipped to the teeth with the sort of arms and ordnance that it needs to inflict the unimaginable on Ukraine. And it is the unimaginable to which we turn our attention this morning. I don't know the answer to this question. Nobody does. The warning from the earliest days, even perhaps from the invasion of Crimea when David Cameron was Prime Minister, his inaction during that period, of course, latterly rewarded by promotion to Foreign Secretary by Rishi Sunak. But the sense that if Putin succeeds, he does not stop. I'm always reminded in several contexts, not just this one, of the failure, the foolishness of thinking that some appetites can be sated. I think history is dotted with examples of well-meaning politicians and diplomats thinking that non-well-meaning politicians and diplomats can somehow be sated, that there is, if you like, a limit to their ambition. I guess most obviously we'd think in this country of Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich, waving that piece of paper around and completely underestimating the toxicity and extent of Hitler's ambitions. But the idea that you can placate or sate somebody possessed of dictatorial ambition or imperial ambition is a lesson we never seem to learn from history. So, in the spirit of ambition and in the spirit of having enormous faith in the quality of contributors to the to the program that I present, Have a crack at that for me. I guess if you live in places, or rather if you have, well, no, you could be living there. Of course you could. LBC reaches all corners of the planet these days. But if you have family in, or you hail from Latvia or Estonia or Finland, you're going to have this question a lot closer to the surface of your thinking than the rest of us do. What happens if Putin wins? 0345 6060 973. And I'd also like you to start ringing in on that now, by the way, because I don't want to inflict any more of my slightly amateurish analysis on you after the next junction. But the other element of the conversation is about what the West has done. Do we know what the West has done? Do we have a full... Actually, I can make a blithe observation about Joe Biden struggling to get the aid through Congress because of various conflicting, self-interested positions being adopted by various American politicians. But do you want to have a crack at answering why we haven't done more? Why the United Kingdom hasn't done more? Boris Johnson, who I did warn you at the time, can't be trusted as far as you could throw him, made great play about what a stalwart supporter of Ukraine he was. But, I mean, looking at the situation now, I don't think we can claim in the last 6 months to have been of particular use. Other countries way ahead of us on the question of supply and support. So there will also be people listening to this program, and I'm very conscious of this. There'll be quite a lot of people listening to this program who are Ukrainian, either here as a consequence of the war or here before the war even started. There will also be people listening to this program who have stepped up to the plate and sheltered Ukrainian refugees during the unfolding crisis. And they perhaps, both of those categories, will have had this conversation a lot closer to the forefront of their minds than most of us have. So whatever your perspective on this, and whatever your experience, I want to know your answer to the question of what happens if Putin wins. And as a secondary, supplementary question, why haven't we, the UK, and the answer might simply be that we just don't have that heft anymore. We just don't matter like we used to, however hard some people try to pretend that we do. We've denuded and diluted our power on the world stage by a variety of decisions taken over the last few years, most obviously Brexit, I suppose. But if the answer to the question of why we haven't done more is because we can't, then that is important to hear as well, isn't it? It is 16 minutes after 10. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. What happens if Putin wins? And why haven't we done more? We keep hearing about the importance of maintaining our status as a world power. Rishi Sunak on Wednesday was trying to sort of goad Keir Starmer over being less effective in the arena of defence. And yet, as some people see as a tinderbox that could spark World War III swings in the direction of our sworn enemies, we don't seem to have done much at all. 0345 6060 973. It's 10:17.
James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 10 is the time. It was weird, actually. It was kind of shivery. I almost thought the question was looming on the horizon. And then it dropped. A journalist speaking to one of the finest foreign correspondents that this country has ever produced, and the question came, what if Putin wins? I don't know that any of us are really ready for that. I don't just mean civilians and citizens, I mean governments perhaps, and even military. George is in Collier's Wood to kick things off. George, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller.
Well,
nice
you've picked a subject. You've picked a nice, easy subject to break your duck with, haven't you?
Well, I'm on the right of politics, so I just kind of listen to you.
Carry on.
But I think this is an issue that crosses party politics and left and right. My own view is, I'm not pro-EU particularly, but I think the EU was. I think Ukraine had a right to want to join the EU. I don't think NATO was a threat, but I do think we've allowed Putin to go this far. We should have spotted this with Crimea. We turned a blind eye. And I think if he wins, that's a green light to China with Taiwan, and that's going to cause problems for Japan. And you're going to have an Asia-Pacific war. And I'm not an expert, of course, but I'm sure many analysts would agree that that's the risk. And I think at that point, if he does win, I think that's the point where we have to put troops right up to the Ukrainian border, NATO troops. That's such a dangerous thing to say.
It'd be two. You mean the Ukrainian border on this side of the Ukrainian border? You mean Poland and Finland and places like that?
Of course.
Right.
I think if he takes Ukraine or even part of Ukraine, we have to stop. Can I say pussyfooting about?
Yeah, of course.
I think it's time. And as I said, I'm slightly on the right of politics. There's parts of Trump I like.
Really?
Parts I don't like. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe have that conversation another day.
But my point, the reason I mention him is because I'm really, really scared that if he wins, his rhetoric about turning away from the world and not intervening in any more wars, if that happens, that again is carte blanche to Putin and all these other dictators around the world to say, right, America's not interested anymore. Let's go for it.
Is it? I mean, in some ways, we could have had this conversation in 2014, couldn't we? And he invaded the Crimean Peninsula. The West sat on their hands, and he consolidated his position. And then, 8 years later, he set his sights on the rest of Ukraine. Effectively, is it the case that Westerners sort of prevaricate because they don't think he'll go far enough to provoke a response, and then he actually turns the dial up incrementally and ends up doing something that if he did it on day one would provoke a response?
I think perhaps the opposite, James.
Yeah, I do as well, as now I've said it out loud, because if he'd taken Kyiv in 2 days, he wouldn't have stopped there, would he?
No, but I think also there's this phrase in the "don't poke the bear." There's this sort of, this Russian bear that's sleeping, and if you poke it, that's it, you're done for. And so I suspect with Crimea it was a case of, look, fine, let's just let him have Crimea. He'll leave it at that. We don't want to provoke him, and I think that was the mistake. And
finally, George, why have we done? You can of course dispute the description that I'm about to apply, but why have we done so little?
I think we're scared. I think our politicians are scared. And my brother's on the right of politics as well, but we disagree on this fundamentally. He thinks we should just let him take part of Ukraine, sign a deal, make sure that deal says no more. He thinks essentially placate.
Has your brother heard of Neville Chamberlain?
I've said that to him. He thinks, look, it's start on nuclear war. That's what he thinks.
Well, it's funny you mention nuclear war. It was the first text, not the first text, but a text that came in just while you were talking. Thank you, George. Says your lack of understanding, this is directed at me, of the Ukrainian war and your peddling for a nuclear war is breathtaking, which is it's an interesting contribution, but not one I fully understand, which perhaps proves your point for you. Thank you, George. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I wonder whether, I mean, as George and I have kind of demonstrated, trying to answer the question of what happens if Putin wins is an exercise in theoretics. But the question of why we've done so little may be even more interesting the longer the conversation goes on, and what it tells us about our status in 2024, what it tells us about the domestic situation in this country, and perhaps the myth of military might, albeit statistically we still matter. We don't perhaps matter enough. Gordon's in Kings Lynn. Gordon, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Again, first-time caller. And,
welcome, Gordon.
Thank you. I returned from Ukraine on Sunday, having spent two weeks out there.
Gosh. How lucky for me you had your radio on this morning.
It is. I run a project whereby we supply vehicles and equipment to the Ukrainian armed forces on the front line.
Crikey.
It's a small project.
Yes.
We've delivered 8 Land Rovers. We delivered vehicles 7 and 8 full of equipment and supplies last week. And I was in Kharkiv the day before the Russians came over the border. And then we went down to Izium and to Liman, which are very much on the front lines. And the conversations I were having were with troops on the front. And I've now got quite a few friends out there who are Ukrainian men and women who are fighting, volunteer fighters on the front lines. Their general perception is that they fully understand that globally there are other events in the world which have taken Ukraine off the front pages of the newspapers and out of the media. They understand what they really find frustrating, I think, is the lack of ongoing military and governmental support. They understand that the media is a fickle beast, but I think there is I think morale, out of all of the visits that I've done, I think on this occasion, morale was probably at its lowest. There are many units that have plenty of Western weapons and ammunition and are indeed planning offensives. But there are also many units who are not doing so well and are suffering from lack of ammunition and do feel that they are. I think their perception is that they're losing a lot of compatriots, a lot of brothers and sisters, essentially because the West has failed to provide the weapons which they promised.
What does I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. On all sorts of levels. Just even you were fascinating, Gordon. I don't want to use up all the time before the junction on you, as opposed to what you've just told me. But what's your background? How did you get involved in something as serious, if you like, but also as potentially hazardous as delivering equipment to Ukrainian troops?
It was nothing more than when the war first started, there was an appeal for some medicines to be delivered to the Ukrainian consulate in Poland. I did about 5 or 6 trips to Poland in my own sort of vehicle, my Land Rover, filled it up with kit and equipment and took it over. But during that process, I met, and it was in the very early stages of the war, I met lots of young men, not just young men, but older men who were saying goodbye to wives, girlfriends, mums, dads, daughters and sons, and they were getting into minibuses and literally hacking their way to Kyiv to the front to be handed AK-47s to take part in the defence of Kyiv.
And you've kept in touch with them, effectively?
Well, it was that sense of they had no equipment. You know, there was young guys in tracksuits and baseball caps getting into minibuses and heading to the front. They had no protective equipment. They had nothing. So it was during that trip, well, that last trip that I did with the medicines, that I decided that we needed to do more, so hence started a small project.
You're amazing. That's incredible. And it gives you these insights, these perspectives that obviously are not very pleasant at the moment, because from what you've just said, this is the lowest morale has ever been, and you describe also that attitude has gone, hasn't it? The idea of all hands to the pump, I'm rushing to the front in my tracksuit and baseball cap, that now it's conscription has risen and there's a struggle to bring people back or bring people in. But you describe morale being at an all-time low and crucially, perhaps, for this conversation, a sense even of betrayal by the West?
Yes. I would say that there is, to a degree. I would also say that there's also a huge sort of chasm opening up in Ukraine society, which I've never seen before.
Go on.
So when you're on the front, and when you're in towns like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Izium, Liman, I mean, Liman is a city, say the size of King's Lynn, where the only thing that lives there are rats and dogs. Everything has been destroyed, everything. And you live with the constant rolling thunder of artillery in the background. It's a permanent backdrop. But, you know, when in those places, it is, the way I describe it to people, it's a little bit like Mad Max.
Really?
It's hard to describe. All you will see are troops, and every vehicle is painted NATO green, olive green, camouflaged, and every vehicle is pressed into service. Some of them have huge attachments on the front of them, battering rams. You see, it is literally like Mad Max. But then you take an 18-hour train journey north to Lviv, which is in the west near the Polish border.
Yeah.
And the town square is literally full. Every restaurant, every bar is full. And it is a serious, mind-bending experience if you're at the front or you're a soldier getting off those trains and you then see the rest of Ukraine living a very normal life.
Good Lord. I mean, that's war, in a way. I mean, certainly modern war, unless you're looking at the kind of, you know, getting caught, the Germans getting caught on their way to Stalingrad or something like that. That life behind the front has always gone on relatively as normal in European wars compared to life at the front. But that must sap some of the resolve of the soldiers that you describe. It's as if they're two parallel universes, and people living in the Mad Max version feeling increasingly forgotten by the people living in the other version?
They do, and there's a huge amount of animosity growing now.
Right.
And
this is terrifying.
It is, and you know, and I understand both worlds, and I understand that life has to go on. But you find yourself, you know, I was standing in the town square in Lviv, and I just wanted to put my backpack down
Yes.
and scream at the top of my voice.
Do you know what's going on?
Do you know what's going on? And every man and woman need to put their shoulder to the wheel. Otherwise, there is going to be no Ukraine.
Which brings me to the question that informs today's programme. In your view, what happens? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you clearly would be of the view that the prospect of Putin succeeding is higher now than it has been since the first days of the invasion. What happens if he wins?
There seems to be this perception that Putin is just looking for land, and there was this whole range of stories that were projected by the Russians as to why they were conducting this special military operation, as they call it. In reality, many Russians who, whether they be prisoners of war or Russians that you meet who are now fighting on the Ukrainian side, their view is that the average Russian who was on the other side, their view is, why should Ukraine, or why should the average Ukrainian live better than a Russian? And don't forget that outside of the major cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the vast continent, Russia is huge. And in that landmass, poverty is rife. 20% of Russians still have an outside toilet.
Yeah.
It is, and so with the propaganda mixed with the sense that there was a huge amount of animosity to Ukraine because Ukraine was turning to the West.
Yeah.
It wanted to be part of Europe. It was embracing NATO.
And you can't underestimate the power of a completely controlled media. So they're getting an entirely bent analysis of the facts, the Russian public, most of the time.
Absolutely, and there is. Ukraine is really at a critical moment now, and all of the trips that I've done and all of the times that I've been, I've never been so worried. Yes, I'm talking to individuals and friends in various units, and they're losing people, and that has its own, is morale sapping in and of itself. But the fact that they feel that they have, for whatever reason, all of the support and all of the words from the West about "don't worry, we're standing with you," that has fallen completely by the wayside. They've
crumbled to dust, which is why that second question accompanied the apocalyptic one at the very start of this hour. Gordon, I never know whether or not I'll get callers like you when I jump into the deep end at 10 o'clock in the morning, but when I do, it's a source of enormous gratitude. Do you want to tell us more about your organisation? A few people are asking if they can support you or help you, but it's entirely up to you.
We if everybody goes to Operation Freelander on Facebook, we're a small group. There's 3 of us, effectively, and we raise money. We purchase Land Rover Freelanders, mechanics rebuild them, we refurbish them, we paint them, we equip them, we take out equipment that they need. This time we took out chainsaws, optics, combat boots, specific to the units that we're supplying. And anybody who wants to contact us, contact us on Facebook, via Facebook, and we will be setting up another Operation Freelander, and we will be setting up another Facebook a fundraising page. The difficulty is that most of the fundraising organisations don't allow us on their platforms because we're supporting the military.
Because it's a war. We learnt yesterday with a tale of a viral plumber. Sometimes causes online are not quite what they appear to be. So I invite you to publicise your organisation with a tiny scintilla of hesitation. But having spoken to you for the best part of 20 minutes, I just sensed that was, and looking at my inbox as well, I just sensed that was something that people wanted to hear. Gordon, keep in touch. It is 10:34. I'm sure you understand why we're going to the news a little late. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
10:38 is the time. A lot of admiration coming in for both what Gordon does and the clarity of his explanations. I'm sure he won't mind me reminding you that it is but one perspective, and others are welcome. Hannah says, that was absolutely fascinating. I never thought about the idea that many Russians might be simply jealous of what Ukraine has as it aligns itself with the West. Of course, it's easier to hate than to look inward and direct that anger and hate towards Putin. Absolutely fascinating. I agree, but it didn't it, towards the end, refocus attention on that supplementary question this hour, which is, why have we done so little? I kind of think the problem with one of the billion problems with Boris Johnson is that he is so morally corrupt. I don't think that's an opinion, that's just counting. But he did demonstrate that the notion of being at the front of the queue of supporters of Ukraine, certainly in the early days of the war, was a popular political position to adopt. So you don't even need to be courageous or brave to do it. You could be entirely cynical and self-serving, as of course Boris Johnson always is. And yet subsequently, I don't know if you can count Liz Truss's 49 days in the job, but subsequently the sense of the United Kingdom being a stalwart, staunch supporter of Zelensky and Ukraine has dissipated with every passing month and year, hasn't it? And I don't fully understand why. Maybe it is just a reflection of our genuine status on the world stage rather than a sort of inflated PR-style status perpetrated by Boris Johnson. If you want to join the conversation, the number is 0345 6060973. Remember that second question is why have we done so little? Why are we doing so little? But the central inquiry this hour is what happens if Putin wins? And I mean, obviously we don't know, but it's probably time to start wondering. Helder is in Enfield. Helder, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Thanks for the opportunity. Big fan, always have been.
Thank you.
James, a little bit of background, okay?
Yes.
I'm 43 years old now, but once upon a time, I was a young NATO soldier serving in a NATO base, and our purpose was only one, and it was to keep the Russians out of Europe, okay?
Right. Yes.
Unfortunately, us in the West fell into a false sense of security, because this is a war that's been in the making for 20 years. Okay,
yes.
And I'll explain. There is a gentleman called Alexander Dugin, which is called in Russia The Brains of Putin.
Yes.
He wrote a book in 1996 called The Foundations of Geopolitics, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at it, if you read it, it is a roadmap for what's happened in the past 20 years, from the invasion of areas in Georgia to Ukraine and so on and so forth. Unless he's today's Nostradamus, he
It's a textbook, really, and it also looks at the control of information, doesn't it, and the manipulation of information, I think, and the ways in which you can turn the West into a place that would be powerless to resist the imperial march that he dreams of in that text.
But exactly what he wrote, it has been put in place. One of the big points that he makes is they had to separate Britain from Europe.
Yes.
And lo and below, we get Brexit. Another point he makes is to destabilize the United States from within, using race wars and so on and so forth, by whatever means possible.
Yeah.
Lo and behold, we get Trump. James, we in the West are sleepwalking. We are already in World War III. Okay, the Russians know this. That's why they've changed their economy completely into a war footing.
This is the point Tobias Elwood. This is the point Tobias Elwood was making earlier in the week by just pointing out what the change in personnel at the top of the Russian military means.
Yes, and we are not taking this seriously at this moment in time, and it's going to bite us. Unfortunately, a year ago, I was positive that Ukraine could ride it out with all our support and so on and so forth. As it stands, between the Americans playing silly buggers in Congress and not giving them the aid they needed when they needed it, okay?
Yes.
And some countries in the West, unfortunately, Britain springs to mind, not pulling their weight.
Who is pulling their weight? I sense you watch things a little bit more closely than the rest of us. I presume the Baltic states are aware of the jeopardy.
Oh, massively. Very quietly, as into not to poke the Russian bear at this moment in time. But the Poles have just massively rearmed themselves. They're spending, from memory, 4% of their gross product, gross income in armaments. The Romanians, for the past year, have been building a motorway 24 hours a day, 365 days a day, with a motorway from their western border to the border of Ukraine. And they have already purchased a load of Korean tanks as well. And the Baltics are petrified.
When did your pendulum swing? When did you shift from... When in the last 12 months did your optimism disappear, Helder?
When in America,
the
far right, when Congress went nuts, and the Trump brigade managed to stop aid for 6 months or 6 or 7 months, they've done it once, they can do it again. Now, the Western countries in the EU are doing all they can, but they haven't got the firepower the Americans have.
No.
And Britain is shying away. Unfortunately,
are you sure that's true? Are you sure that's fair that Britain is shying away? I mean, I haven't got any grounds on which to challenge you, but I just want to double check, if I may.
Okay, given Britain's industrial and economic capacity, a lot more could be done, James.
So, the military-industrial complex could be weighing in. I mean, I suppose for somebody like you with your background of service, the thought of running out of ammunition sends a whole different kind of ship. Yeah.
It's staggering. James, in the year 2000, I was in a NATO base in Lisbon, and obviously there's a lot of stuff I can't discuss, but some of the gear we had, and this is going back 24 years, was state-of-the-art and plentiful, nothing lacked. To now find themselves in an active shooting war with no artillery shells, it's like, how? How are they meant to?
And that's an almost impossible question to answer. But do you want to have a go? I mean, is it a lack of will? Is it the political turmoil in this country? Your analysis of Dugin, who I haven't read in full, but I've read plenty of praises of him, and it is perfectly fair to say that the book explains why Brexit was a key strategic aim for Russia, as Peter in Finchley reminds me, because it weakens the US's influence in Europe. But the question of why the UK wouldn't have just done more is one that I still find quite hard to answer.
Because the UK is minimised after Brexit. Brexit was part of the Russian master plan. There's a reason why Boris Johnson left a Foreign Office NATO meeting with all the plans, left his security team, jumped on a plane to Italy and went and met the son of a KGB spy.
I think the dad was there as well, actually. It emerged a year or two later. The son, of course, is now in the House of Lords, and the warnings of the vetting committee that wouldn't be a very wise move were completely ignored by Boris Johnson. But some people still, when they hear you say that, will not be ready to accept it. And of course, with Johnson, the balance between just being an absolute liability and being responsible for bad stuff is always quite hard to call. But yeah, I mean, certainly in the context of turmoil, confusion, domestic division, all of those things will be answers to the question of why we haven't done more. Helder, thank you. I think between you and Gordon, the rest of us listening today can feel a degree of privilege at the quality of the perspective. We'll talk again, I think. It's 10:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:49. Alan Sunderland texts to say it's not just issues in the US Congress. Western politicians have essentially stopped Ukraine attacking Russia with Western weapons. This means Russia can resupply and manufacture with impunity, and Ukraine is now a 20th century style war of the factories, with only one side really being in the game. However, the effect on Russia from catastrophic casualties may eventually prove important, as in World War I. Tim Marshall is a foreign affairs analyst whose books generally spend even more time in the bestseller charts than air fryer recipes, which is saying something in the current market. His latest, The Future of Geography, How Power and Politics in Space Will Change Our World, has kept that tradition alive. And Tim joins me now. It's a slightly apocalyptic question, Tim, but it's one that I think it's probably time to ask. What happens if Putin wins?
World of pain. And I mean world, not just Europe. This debate's been going on for several months now, sparked by Trump essentially saying that he's going to sort it all out within 24 hours if he comes back to power. Majority of Republicans in Congress want to at least reduce support for Ukraine. Trump talks about ending it. Whether he would or not, we don't know yet.
Of course.
But if he did, then Russia will win, because they've given more than the Americans, than all the Europeans combined. And Ukraine couldn't hang on without them. So they either have to be defeated properly, or they go to the table with Russia in a very weakened position. So the knock-on effects from that is that, well, go back briefly. He took parts of Georgia in 2008. He took parts of Ukraine in 2014. He used that as springboard to take parts of Ukraine again in 2022. Is there any logical reason to think that he would stop there? No. NATO would be fundamentally weakened. So what are the next targets? The rest of Georgia, either through making sure that the government is beholden to him or take it over militarily. Moldova, where there are 2,000 Russian troops. If NATO then is so enfeebled that it becomes what Macron said, brain dead. And if Trump, and these are big ifs, but these are the scenarios that you asked for, James.
Yes.
In this event, NATO is brain dead, at which point Article 5, going to the help of everybody, starts to fade away, at which point the Baltics are on the table and so is Poland. And then the last bit of the global jigsaw, ask yourself why South Korea and Japan seriously help Ukraine, big time, money and munitions. It's because they get it. They know that if Russia wins, essentially NATO loses and America loses, at which point they're in trouble with China, because China looks at the global scene and thinks, excellent, the Americans are paper tigers. So, it sounds apocalyptic, as you said, but history doesn't stop. We've just seen the biggest invasion in Europe since World War II. And if Russia wins, we will see more of that.
Has Putin played a blinder then, or is it more that circumstances have conspired to sort of ease his passage, as it were?
That's a good question. I think he played a blinder in 2008 and 2014, yes. And then he came pretty unstuck in 2022. And the background to this is that he knows his history. And Lenin, he'll know this quote. Lenin said, when you have a bayonet and you think your opponent is weak, stick it in. If you find mush, keep pushing. If you find something hard, withdraw. And up to 2022, he found mush, our mush. Yeah. And so, of course, he kept pushing. In 2022, finally, the enormity of what he'd been doing and our idiocy, pacifism kills, basically. Finally, people like Germany woke up to this reality. Pacifism can kill. And he found something hard. And for 2 years, about a year and a half, that hardness remained, but it's beginning to crumble. If the Americans pull out, you will have the Germans, the Italians, Spanish, Portuguese, not so much the French. A lot of the Europeans will think, excellent, we can stop spending all our munitions and our money on Ukraine now, because that solidity is beginning to crumble now.
I hadn't thought of that. I thought perhaps that sentence was going to go in the opposite direction, and you were going to say they'll step up to the plate, but it will be too late.
That's interesting, because I think that is what Macron is doing at the moment, until a lesser extent the British, who remain solid. Macron, who was always flip-flopping around, is actually begun to become more solid. And what he's doing is, after Trump said these things, putting into doubt whether America, under him, would continue to support Ukraine, there was this sort of panic. Oh, my God, we can't rely on the Americans anymore, perhaps. Yeah. We better do something. But there's a huge split. The Slovakians will, under the current government, with the unfortunate prime minister and his unfortunate assassination attempt the other day, they will think, Ukraine, go to the table, make peace in a week, and it will weaken position. Hungary would support that. Germany would probably support that. Spain, Portugal, Italy, and one or two others. You would be left with the Baltic states, because they get it, the Czech Republic, Sweden and Finland, the Brits, possibly France. And in no way, shape or form is that enough to sustain the Ukrainian war effort.
Finally, Tim, I have been asking this hour why the Brits haven't done more, but under your analysis, they remain near the forefront of support.
We have our failings, and Mr. Johnson has his failings, but he and the Brits stood up early doors. In fact, they've been standing up since 2014. The British were onto this very early in training cyber resilience and naval assistance and all sorts of things. And if you look at the table of who's helped the most, there's various ways of looking at it. How many munitions have you given? How much money have you given? And then you get into GDP issues. But the British are towards the top of that. Germany has given a lot of money, but as I said, 2 years in, it's beginning. Fatigue has set in. Our munitions stockpiles are incredibly reduced, and we haven't tooled up the European defence industry to start actually manufacturing them again properly. We began a few months ago. Russia began on day one when it realised, oh dear, we haven't done as well as we thought. And their munitions factories, which are working double time now, there is a flow of weapons coming out. We are a couple of years behind them.
And oddly, that is the point that my texter in Sunderland was making just before you came on. Tim Marshall, what are you working on at the moment, Tim? What's the next book?
I'm rewriting Prisoners of Geography, which came out in 2015, because next year is the 10th anniversary. So we're going to weave in all the trends.
Fantastic.
What has happened over the last 10 years? It's been a bumpy 10 years, James. I'm always an optimist. I think that humanity's future is bright eventually, but the next 10 years are going to be bumpy as well.
Tim Marshall, foreign affairs analyst, best-selling author, expert, as if you didn't know before, you will know now, in his latest book, The Future of Geography, How Power and Politics in Space Will Change Our World. Thank you, Tim. It's coming up to 10:58. I'm going to squeeze in one more call if I can. Simon is in Kingston. Simon, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
I have, again, a lot of vested interest in Ukraine. I am a builder, and I have had a lot of Eastern European workers working for me, including Ukrainians. And over the years, I've sort of kept contact with them, kept friendly with them. So, of course, when it then kicked off again in 2022, I then got actively involved and started buying military equipment for their defence. I also found out I actually had a British friend who's ex-military. He went out there, who in very early days, he's still out there now as a volunteer, fighting on the front line. So I was then feeding him in equipment as well. We bought a pickup truck and the scopes, sniper scopes, that kind of stuff. And I've been actively sort of buying drones as and when I can afford it. I've tried to raise money, but just nobody over here is interested. It's really hard to actually get people to get involved.
Why do you think that is? I mean, we've got a cost of living crisis. We've got homelessness going on. We've got water full of sewage. I mean, there are quite a lot of things on people's priority list, but
that's the problem. There's just too much going on, and it's the whole. Obviously, sort of the Tories are sort of dying by a death of 1,000 cuts. And it's just the whole, there's just so much stuff going. And of course, everyone, forgets the fact that the majority of the reason for our energy bills being so high is because of the Ukrainian war. Everyone just blames the government.
Yes.
And so everyone's got their own problems to deal with. So I think that's part of the problem. So I've ended up, what I'm now trying to do, I'm an old, I used to be in the music industry as an old punk, so I'm selling all my old memorabilia off and making good money from that, and using that to buy more drones, etc. Because it's the only way I can sort of carry on raising funds, because I put stuff out on media, on Facebook, etc. But nobody really responds.
Just doesn't land.
And I can't sort of badger people. It's just.
And you can't look away. You can't look away because of the way that you're built. But briefly, I
went to Ukraine last year to visit them. I went down to the front lines and went to Kyiv and Lviv. And your first caller, he was absolutely spot on. The eastern side is in proper war mode, including Kyiv. But then you go to Lviv, and I went for a day out to the mountains. And there's a ski resort on the far left-hand side near Romania. And you'd never know there was a war on. It's all this massive building projects going on, hotels being built.
But is that not inevitable? Or I mean, what point does that, in a sentence, because I'm late for the news, it's becoming my catchphrase this month. Why is that significant? Is you and Gordon are both drawn to this contrast between life...
It feels to me as though it needs to be total war. If you're going to go into like the Second World War,
it's shoulders to the wheel. It's shoulders to the wheel. And if it's not the top priority, if all the focus isn't directed at that front, then that front will fall.
And like you said, you've still got people going out to restaurants and dining and having a great time, and yet there's posters everywhere of all the fallen.
How
like in Lviv, the town square is full of these posters of all the men who've fallen and women, and it's very sobering. And yet at the same time, everyone's out having a good time, and it's just this weird dichotomy. It's a strange mix, and it really confused me.
Yeah, I can see why, and I can see why both you and Gordon remain struck by that, despite the fact that at first glance it wouldn't seem to be the most important element of your experiences, but it speaks to a much deeper malaise, doesn't it? It speaks perhaps to a lack of focus that becomes then a lack of military success. Oh, Lord, what an hour. It is 11:01. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 5 minutes after 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Thank you for that hour. I some days, and especially on Fridays, don't laugh, especially on Fridays, I find myself feeling a bit trepidatious when we are poised to jump into the deepest end of the sort of news pool. But goodness me, you certainly looked after me there. So thank you for that. We move into much easier territory now. The list of subjects that I was going to choose from changes while we're on air because of the mood, really. And I felt that having just contemplated the apocalypse that some of our callers and Tim Marshall alluded to, then a conversation about a woman in Holland who is physically fine, but who is about to avail herself of the assisted dying services available in that country. It was going to be a philosophical, ethical conversation, but I felt perhaps we have had enough darkness. So I'm looking instead at Gary Lineker's latest intervention from the side of the angels, wondering why children are not taught to cook in schools. We may move on to that in the next hour, but from a very specific perspective. You know, when people tell you that they can't cook and you think they're exaggerating, I'm quite interested in people who are actually telling the truth. I mean, I can't boil an egg, and you sort of think, no, of course you can. If you really can't cook, and this, of course, would be a consequence of not having been taught what used to be known as domestic science in school. What do you actually live on? What do you actually eat? We may get onto that in the next hour, but there are a few other contenders at the moment, and I am keen to find out a little bit more about South Africa's request to the International Court of Justice yesterday to urgently order Israel to end its assault on Rafah, to halt its military action across the region, and to allow international investigators and journalists into the territory. This is a court hearing where lawyers for South Africa have expanded a written request for judges to issue an emergency order stopping the offensive into southern Rafah. And Professor Vaughan Lowe, who's a lawyer for South Africa, has said that unless the court acts now, the possibility of rebuilding a viable Palestinian society in Gaza will be destroyed, which of course moves that finding a few weeks ago about the relevance or the necessity, potential plausibility of protecting Palestinian people from potential genocide becomes a little clearer and ever more urgent. So I'm quite keen to find out a little bit more about that as well. But first, working class representation in the film and TV industry has plummeted to the lowest level in a decade. There's a new study out, and I thought about this yesterday, oddly, when we were, or was it the day? I think it was possibly the day before, but we were discussing unemployment from a middle class perspective. I have to qualify that just in case you weren't listening, because it sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? But it's not silly. What happened was Jeremy Hunt and Mel Stride did one of those classic Tory tropes about there being loads of jobs out there if only you could be bothered to look. And I just found myself wondering what I would do if I lost my job. Where would I go? Where would I turn to? My late father lost his job in 1990, and I explained to you on Wednesday that I struggled initially with his decision or his journey to the job centre to sign on and get the help that he was entitled to. But he explained it to me in clear terms, and it made perfect sense. But it struck me that Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt, when they say there are loads of jobs out there, they're not talking about people who were earning 50 grand or more and would therefore be statistically more likely to vote Conservative. They're not. They weren't. I don't know who they were talking about. But if your outgoings are dependent upon your previous salary, which was say £80,000 a year or £55,000 a year, then the jobs into which you could easily slide are not going to touch the sides of your outgoings. And during that conversation, I think we spoke to two people, one of whom would definitely not have described herself as middle class because she came from precisely the sort of background that this story speaks to. But we spoke to two people who worked in the media, and immediately they mentioned that. Something a bit weird happened in my head. Because I work in the media. I don't know whether you've noticed, but I allegedly do, with some success. And I felt my sort of defences rise, because I thought you'll be listening to this, and as soon as they say I work in the media, you'll be thinking, oh, pass me the world's tiniest violin, la-di-da-di-da. And I've probably done you a grave disservice. Or have I? I'll soon be able to tell via your texts and WhatsApps. But as soon as somebody says, I work in the film industry, or I work in the TV industry, or I work in the media, then I just have a sense, and I hope it's wrong, but I don't think it is. I just have a sense that your sympathy pipeline gets turned down a bit. Your tap of sympathy is turned a little bit to the left. I could be wrong. But, you know, if someone rings in and says, I've been a coal miner for 30 years, James, and I can't feed my children, I think they're going to get a different emotional response from the rest of us from someone who says, I've been a cameraman for 30 years or a scriptwriter for 30 years and I haven't had a job for 6 months and I don't know what I'm going to do next and I'm going to lose my job in October if things don't turn around. I could be wrong. I only mention that because you need to park that prejudice to move into this conversation. Because this conversation is about something I happen to care about an awful lot for reasons that you may already be aware of, but if you're not, you soon will be. It is a study that has found that only 8% of creatives, crucially creatives, in the film and TV industries identified as being from a working class background. 60% of those working in the same sector were middle or upper class. That's the highest that it has been in 10 years. Now, do you know that the very first article I ever got published in a vaguely national organ was for a much-missed magazine called G-Spot, where Danny Wallace just did Full Disclosure with me, and it turned out he was there as well, but we didn't go to the office. We worked from home, so we never actually met each other. But it wasn't what it sounds like. I had to caution my mum to stop boasting about it in Sainsbury's at the time, in case people got the wrong idea. It was a club magazine. It was a sort of club-based culture magazine, and I wrote an article about media studies courses and how they were proliferating. And then not long after that, when I'd finally got myself a berth on Fleet Street, I wrote an article, would you believe, feels like a confession this, for The Spectator magazine, long before it became the absolute sewer that it is now. I wrote an article for The Spectator magazine about how the arts, in particular, were becoming dominated by people who'd been to public school. Never mind middle and upper class, but a very specific cohort of people who had been to public school. And it was actually remarkable. And this is going back 52. This is going back about 25 years, almost to the day. And there was a sense even then that a shift was underway, which I identified most obviously as being available to work for nothing or to live in London without earning enough to live in London. So if you had a family flat or you had friends that you could stay with, because, you know, for good or for ill, most of the media and most of the creative industries then, it's changed a bit since, were in London. And if you had to actually work to live in London, like I did when I was trying to get into the media, I was working in menswear, then it was a lot harder to be on the end of the phone and to get a job, or crucially, to spend 6 months knocking on doors, to spend 6 months dropping off your CV, to spend 6 months trying to get in to these kind of industries. So the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre at the University of Sheffield has looked into this and found that the vast majority now of people working in the creative arts are from middle and upper class backgrounds. You don't know you're privileged often. The best line I've seen on the question of privilege is the idea that if you've grown up privileged, if you've spent your whole life enjoying privilege, then equality can feel like oppression. And there's evidence of that. Sometimes it feels everywhere you look. But you don't know you're privileged. So I used to object to the idea that I had got my break in journalism because my dad was a journalist, because by the time I was trying to get onto Fleet Street, all my late father's old mates were either dead or redundant. But of course, even though he didn't get me through the door, once I was through the door, I had a privilege of being able to say to the news editor, oh, I think you used to work with my dad, or being able to say to another journalist, oh, maybe you knew my dad, he was on the Telegraph. And it just gives you a patter, gives you a language. It's a privilege, you know. That might not be quite the right word to use, but it is, in a way, it's a nepotistic privilege because it was a consequence of my background, my family background, that I had a couple of things in my pocket that you wouldn't have had if you'd come from a very different background. And I guess by definition, being the son of a Daily Telegraph journalist made me middle class, even if I hadn't been to a fancy school. So why does this matter? Why does this matter? A consequence, I think, of my privilege is that I'm not going to be that good at explaining to you why it matters. Only 8% of creatives, so look at music, look at the performing arts, 65% of people in those areas are now middle class. 16% from working class backgrounds. One filmmaker told Channel 4 News, who've done a brilliant report on this, there is a sense sometimes that I feel like I don't belong in certain events and certain people I've met who I do feel sometimes judged by. Now, I can't begin to imagine what that's like. I'd never really felt judged on class grounds. I had terrible imposter syndrome when I started on Fleet Street, but that is obviously not the same. I saw Richard Herring, of whom I'm a supreme admirer. I love Richard Herring's work. His podcast is absolutely brilliant. I saw him tweeting yesterday about, because he hadn't gone to public school, he wasn't very good at networking. He wasn't very good at making the connections with the other people that you would need to do to get projects off the ground, and he described it as confidence. You could call it chutzpah, which is linked to private education, not intrinsically. There's plenty of people with loads of chutzpah who left school at 15 and, to coin a cliche, went to work at the local market. But you see, the point is about generalization. So there are two questions here, really. Well, actually, there's more than two, but let's suck it and see. Why is it so? This might seem like a slightly silly question for me to ask, and you might think the answer is obvious, but other people would benefit to hear it. Other people would benefit from hearing it. Why is it so much easier for middle and upper class people to get into the creative arts than working class people? Or if you prefer, why is it so hard for people from a working class background to get into the creative arts? Presuming, of course, that you want to. And I happen to know that you do, because it's some work I do with a charity that I'll tell you a little bit more about later in this hour. So that's question number one. Why does class have such an influence on ability to access creative arts? 8% is a grim figure. It's a 10-year low. But now a question that you don't need a personal perspective on. All right? Why does it matter? Why does it matter? I'll have a go at that myself before 12 o'clock, but it's 11:17 already because we went so late to the news in the last hour. Why does it matter? What does the country lose, in your view, when the representation of the working class in the creative industries is so small? All right? If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. So why is it so hard for working class people to get into the creative industries, film, TV, music, performing arts? 0345 6060 973. And I know that it matters. This isn't a rhetorical question, though. Why does it matter? Let's assemble a really powerful platform of evidence to prove to some of these dreadful Tories who think that if you can't turn a degree into a salary in 10 seconds flat, then the degree is somehow worthless. Why does it matter? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Did anybody notice? I'm just glancing at my inbox on this, and as far as I can tell, 3 people, is it? No, yeah, it's not 10:18. That was a deliberate mistake designed to establish precisely who was actually listening and who wasn't. It was 11:18 when I went to the last junction. It is now 11:21. The power you have over people's lives when you are being relied upon to tell them the time is magical, isn't it? But I don't think you should abuse that power. It happened to me once when a presenter on the radio got the time wrong, and it was an hour. Oh, crikey! One of my kids got a phone call this morning saying that they were missing an exam at school, and obviously panic stations set in there, like you wouldn't believe. But it turned out the school had made a mistake, which is just so whoa. I guess in our house that would not be the place that you reached for first when you find yourself in the middle of a crisis. But that idea that it's 12:20, my God, it can't be 12:20. I'm supposed to be at work at 11 o'clock. But I do my best. Nobody's perfect. I do occasionally make a mistake. This hour is a tough one, really, and it's one where perhaps more than any other hour I've become very conscious of. I use the word privilege a lot on the programme. I think it's important to acknowledge it if you've benefited from it. The weirdest people in the public space at the moment are the ones that enjoyed enormous privilege but spend their lives complaining constantly about people from less privileged backgrounds having access, however limited that access might be, to the sort of jobs that they seem to think are their birthright, you know. And they also, of course, these people describe themselves as anti-establishment. But talking about the creative arts now, not the politics, why is it so hard for working class people to get through the door? And why does it matter? Charlie is in Kensington, which is not known, Charlie, as a bastion of working class population. Well, I suppose it is, actually, depending on what part of Kensington you're in. What made you pick up the phone?
So I work with actors. I have a company that does pretty much exactly this. We try and help actors represent themselves without the enormous cost that it can require. We do pretty much everything on a pay what you can basis to try and make it a little bit easier for people to be able to kind of demonstrate how talented they are without it requiring thousands and thousands of pounds of investment to do so. So
this is answer number one, is that it's solvency. If you've got the money, so what would you spend the money on? What would a middle class person trying to get into acting with a few quid in the bank be able to do that someone who didn't have a few quid in the bank could not do?
I think it comes down to two different things. The first is primarily getting really, really good at the thing, right? So practice, dedicating time and resources to
and what have you.
Paying for training, that kind of thing. And then it's demonstrating to people that you are very, very good at it. And that comes through kind of reels and headshots and those sorts of things. Time as well, not having to go and work 40 hours a week at the restaurant or the hotel or the call center or whatever it is. These are all things that make an enormous difference to your ability to really kind of dedicate yourself to the pursuit of your acting career.
And why does it matter?
It matters because stories are incredibly important. Just culturally, if we want to see real progression, I think a major part of that is through the stories that we tell and the storytellers. If we want more diverse faces, then we need more diverse stories, and we need more diverse storytellers. There's a really interesting statistic. I can't remember where I saw it, but it was about diversity in different kind of roles in the film industry. So you saw most diversity in performers in commercials, but then as the seniority of the role increased, the diversity got less. Okay. So when you get all the way up to like showrunners, that was the least diverse area. So if we want to have more diverse stories, then it's really, really important that we make access to the kind of like entry-level positions in acting greater, which is also a problem, is that there aren't very many entry-level positions because short films don't make an awful lot of money and fringe theatre doesn't make an awful lot of money. So there's not too many opportunities for people to
and the world has changed, actually, hasn't it? Because how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 28.
Yeah, you sound young, in a good way. I mean, that you make me feel grizzled. You make me feel grizzled and cynical. But when I was your age, it was still possible. Pretty much, certainly when I was 18, it was still possible to sort of survive, as it were, and set up community theatre groups. Julie Hesmondhalgh, probably best known as Hayley in Coronation Street, was my guest on last week's Full Disclosure, which has gone down very well. And she talks with such power and beauty about the working class role in storytelling and about its diminishment. And in its simplest terms, what you describe is representation, isn't it? You can't, you know, the industry will not be telling the stories of people who are not in the privileged cohorts that access the creative roles. And that's the difference between creative, is that they are the people who determine what the stories are. Why did you do that? What made you go down that path? It's an odd thing to do at 28, if you don't mind me saying so.
What made me choose this industry?
Focus particularly on trying to help people from backgrounds different from your own into this industry.
Sure. Well, I grew up in very, very working class areas. While I'm currently in West London, I grew up in a place called Stranraer in southwest Scotland, which is a very working class area, and then Wakefield in West Yorkshire, which is another very working class area. And it was a single parent household, and my mum was on disability benefits, and we had absolutely no money at all for growing up. And while going through that, you know, you still see what the opportunities are like for people who do have the opportunity to, you know, really invest kind of time and money in the one precise thing that they want to do.
Yeah.
And
focus,
exactly. And I think that it's, you know, there's a lot of kind of talk about how what the best way to increase representation is. And I think that we see most diversity in the lowest economic group. So for me and my company, what we try and do is we try and focus on opportunity creation for the lowest economic group, in the knowledge that the kind of the repercussion of that will be more diverse faces on our screens in our theatres.
Well, apart from the Daily Mail editorials complaining about it, that can only be a good thing. What's the company called, Charlie? You don't have to tell me.
It's called ACTA, AKTA.
Well done. Thank you, mate. It is. It's an important conversation. 28 minutes. A little bit of lazy stereotyping there from me, because Charlie sounds middle class and is calling in from Kensington. I presume that he had a background more akin to mine than to his own, which I suppose is part of the conversation that we're having. It is coming up to 29 after 11. Here's a little test for you. I've had a text off someone I admire enormously. I mean, really, really admire. And we must get them onto full disclosure, and they describe themselves as one of the last working class successful people on TV. I'm going to give them a ring during the break, but I want you to try to see if you can work out who it actually is, that could, with their tongue slightly in their cheek, but could with some justification describe themselves in those terms, because 8% is a terrifying figure, particularly when you sit it alongside Tory attempts to essentially limit further education to courses that can be immediately translated into financial success, or to people who can afford to pay for a creative degree without any help from the state. It's coming up to 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 11. Kate Robbins makes a great point. You'll know Kate from various, I suppose most recently from Afterlife Series 3, from the couple next door, and from Unforgotten. But she points out that being on the dole paid for writers to persist and thrive with writing not that long ago. There was a demographic chutzpah in the 70s of being working class and entering the arts that has now disappeared. If you came from Liverpool, you had the Beatles, but you also had Alan Bleasdale and Willie Russell in the Everyman Theatre. I suppose you had John Godber at the whole truck as well. At the Royal Exchange in Manchester. My interview with Robert Lindsay on Full Disclosure years ago, a couple of years ago, was one of the highlights of my interviewing career, because he talked about stuff that is close to my heart for reasons I don't fully understand. Sally Lindsay, honestly, you wait ages for one Coronation Street legend to pop up in front of you, and it was Julie Hesmanhaupt on Full Disclosure last week, and then two come along at once. You will, of course, know Sally Lindsay from Coronation Street, but also latterly from Scott and Bailey, Still Open All Hours, and most recently alongside another one of my favourite people in showbiz, Robin Asquith, in the Madame Blanc mysteries, which she co-created and produced. Sally's in Greenwich. Why did you pick up the phone, Sally?
Hi, James. Big
Hello.
fan. A bit nervous.
It's only me.
I know, it's only you. I think this is the only subject I'm absolutely, completely qualified to call you on, actually. So I was very, very working class from East Manchester, and nobody from my area ever went into the arts. It was almost impossible, because you just weren't expected to. Anyway, to cut a long story short, there was lots of chances, that I missed really along the way, because I didn't know how to get into acting. I was always very good at it, but I didn't know how to make that access. And a lot of it is about financial support, James. It's about the fact that, for example, when I finally bit the bullet, I discovered I could really do well in university, and I was encouraged, because then my fees were paid for, which is nice. And I was encouraged to go into acting, because my tutor at the time, who wrote for the Times, said, if you could write your thesis like you could act, then you'd be getting a double first. You need to do this. And I was like, blimey, I can't believe it. So I went along and got into acting, but it was almost impossible. I went to a little acting school up the north. I worked 3 jobs. And I remember just pushing and pushing and pushing, but it shouldn't be that hard. I remember the last audition I went to before I was giving up. It was an open audition for a big Northern, in London, brilliantly. Right. A big Northern play, and it was a #1 tour at the time. And in those days, they used to employ leads that weren't off the telly, as it were. Yeah. And I auditioned, and unbelievably, I got that job. But that was my last £40. That's how long ago it was. 25 years I've been on the telly now. But £40 it was to get. That was my last £40 return ticket to Manchester, and that was it. And I was giving up. Now, God knows how much tax over the years as a working actor, constant working actor on leads on television, and I write as well. I write, Madam Barn can produce it. And I just think we're going to lose all those voices. We're going to lose my voice because it's impossible now. I look at the kids now and I go, it's impossible for you to even start because there's just nothing. There's no local theatre. There's no schemes. There's nothing for us. And I think all these voices you're going to lose, like me being part of the pile, but, Julie Walters, like you said, Alan Bleasdale, Victoria Wood, it's crazy. And so this is why I'm quite clearly passionate about it.
Well, clearly, but incredibly, and it's a lot more powerful coming from you than it would be from me. It is, as you've just alluded to, Sally, it's got harder and harder and harder. Since you already had a struggle that would have been very different from the struggle of coming out of a London drama school or a private school or a public school like mine. It's measurable, and we're of a very similar age. I probably shouldn't mention that. It's very ungallant.
No, we are. 7, 9, 50. It's all right. I'm 50. It's fine. I'm good with that.
Yeah, fine. We're of a very similar age, and it now would be close to impossible to make the journey that you made.
You see, there's this thing where
unless you get on Corrie from the Oldham. Is the Oldham Actors Workshop still there?
Yeah, but even that's different now because I don't know whether it is different now because it was a long time ago that I left. But we were searched in I was searched from the local area. I've just put in shows on. I did like a stand up and everything, and that's how I was discovered. And now because of advertising and because of the way things are, they usually have to have people with experience unless you're very young. I mean, I was 27 when I joined Coronation Street, so that was, in our industry, is practically old. But unless you're very young and you've got no experience, they'll usually get a name now. So even that's different. Yes. And I do find, and also you need these voices. I'll never forget.
Well, tell me why it matters. Tell me what we lose if we lose the diversity of voices.
Because your experience comes through your writing. It has to. I mean, I'd have a crack at Bridgerton, but I think I'd be quite rubbish at it. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. And funnily enough, Downton Abbey was written by a bloke that went to my school, which kind of makes your point for you.
Well, and I'm not saying I couldn't. I'd go into massive research and write it, but I think if you've got a passionate voice, you like Coronation, they wrote on Coronation Street back in the day. I mean, the best ones are the ones from the working class. There was some that God love them had a go, but it was just sort of by gum where's me whip it, and you'd look at your script and go, this probably wasn't. This dialogue was never said in the 18th century. Never mind now. And this is what I mean. It's about your experience. It's about living in poverty or living on the breadline, living in working class Britain, and it's something that experience you can't really relate. If you haven't, you just can't. You can have a go, and some writers are brilliant at it, and I don't want to put them down at all because.
I understand.
But those voices are really important, and those experiences, and that's where your pot of diversity is as well. And that's where the amount of times no disrespect to you, or but you go into a room and there's just a load of white males from public schools, and you're trying to say. I mean, I've had people in meetings saying, "Well, I don't know any man that would do that."
Right. Gosh.
And you just go.
Well, I do.
But it's happened. Yes. I do. I know loads of them.
Trust me.
Or
I haven't made this up.
So that's sort of my thing about it. So I am very passionate about this because I do think we're losing those voices. And don't get me wrong, the actors from all the posh schools are brilliant actors. But if you look in Hollywood now, they're all from those schools.
Well, it's gone backwards since the sort of kitchen sink era, hasn't it? When when people like I guess you think of Alan Bates, or you'd think of Albert Finney, Peter O'Toole, who were not going to come through the patio. Sheila Delaney writing, but there's a staging of that not long ago that I went to actually. But they're not coming through the patio doors, are they? Carrying a tennis racket anymore? That kind of drama.
I mean, before Sheila Delaney, I was very lucky enough to play Helen at the Royal Exchange years ago.
Wow.
When we relaunched it, and it was very an emotional experience for me because it was literally packed. Because the people of Manchester, the first time I ever felt like a rock star, because the people of Manchester wanted to see themselves. And we as working class people, what I do is, whether you like my kind of stuff or not, I represent a certain type of person, a certain class of person, yes. and that's what I represent. And people have always argued love to see themselves because it validates them. It validates, where they are in this country, and it's unreachable. And your chap was talking before. I just got the last bit of it, saying that they go into rooms and they don't feel. I still go into rooms, and I've got my own company, and I've got a very successful TV program, but I still go into rooms and I don't really think I'm being talked down to, and that's me. So you think, God knows these kids are coming, with this unbelievable raw talent that is just not being harnessed.
And we're going to... did you ever flirt with the idea of changing? Did you ever flirt with the idea of changing your accent or changing your sort of...
Well, I can if you pay me enough.
No, I know that. I meant in real life. I
know some people have, and it was. I was very lucky because there was people like Terry Christian and people started coming through, and which on the grand scheme of things in the media that sort of allowed me to have my accent, and so I've always retained my accent. I live in London, and I always, I'm the most Mancunian person in London, really. But even my kids take the mickey out of me, but which kids do, don't they? But I just think that I never really tried to because I didn't need to, and the jobs I was getting, like my first job was in the royal family. Right. So we were part of a revolution where that kind of television was massively popular and very accepted, and those geniuses were allowed to cook. Now, I think we're still there, but we're pushing all the time. So not only working class, it's women as well, and we're going back in time, I think, and it needs to be a positive, positive.
What would you do if I put you in charge? What would you do first? Final question.
Oh, what I would do, I would literally go right to the bottom of all the scripts that everyone's chucked out because you're not from the right school, and I'd put them right at the top, and I'd make them.
Oh, wow. So just looking at what gets made and then fitting
and what
in,
gets chucked out,
working backwards,
definitely.
That makes perfect sense. You played Michelle in the royal family.
I did, yeah.
Twiggy's girlfriend.
I can't actually say any of the lines because they were...
Sorry, you'd get Ofcom would be all over me like a rash if you said any of those words out loud. But I mentioned Julie Hesmondhalgh before you came on. You've mentioned Terry Christian. I'll mention Ralph Little from the Royal Family, all of whom, Sally, have appeared on the Full Disclosure podcast. So can I take it that you'd be keen if we get in touch?
I would be honoured, and I'm rather annoyed you not asked me already.
I thought you might say that, which is why I'm very glad that the commercial break is just around the corner. But we will be in touch, and I don't mean a showbiz. We will be in touch. I mean we really will be in touch as long as you give me the gossip on Robin Asquith.
It's too much. How long have you got?
That's a separate show entirely. Sally, thank you. I'm so glad you were listening today. And that simple explanation of the importance of access, I couldn't have come from anybody better qualified to do it. It really couldn't. So do look out for that imminent episode of Full Disclosure as well. 11:44 is the time. Tim's in Belfast. Tim, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Whenever people were growing up in Northern Ireland, particularly at my age, and even recently, the idea of saying that you wanted to work in the creative industries was pretty limited. There were advertising agencies, and that was about it. But in about 2005, Northern Ireland Screen got set up. And in recent years, I'm sure you're completely aware of this, that Game of Thrones, Line of Duty, various other major television programmes have all been produced in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
And that came about because they put in place a system that included education. And you mentioned something about the people sort of slightly sneering about the jobs, but part of it's even before that, people being aware that these types of jobs exist. So NI Screen created a thing called the Moving Image Arts A-Level, which was then started to be taught throughout the schools. They then developed the Moving Image Arts GCSE. Whenever Game of Thrones then arrived, there were people who had been through this process who could apply for jobs. Every time the programme was made, there were a number of trainees from all sorts of backgrounds. Anyone who was interested to
This is deliberate. I mean, this is engineering to make sure that people are getting into these slots who would not ordinarily be able to access them.
But you've got to remember in Northern Ireland, they weren't even accessible. There were no slots to get to.
No, of course not. So first of all, you've got to attract the productions, and then you can start inserting the candidates.
And it was a chicken and egg. As more production came, more jobs were created. The talent base is phenomenal. I mentioned a guy who used to be a market gardener in a place called Strangford, is now internationally renowned as a set dresser for And there are people of all, you can hardly shake a stick in Northern Ireland without having met somebody who's been an extra, but also whose children have gone on to work from literally all sorts of backgrounds, have gone on to work in the film industry, not just here, but internationally. And every Game of Thrones had 30 trainees.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that bit. I didn't know it was so rigidly imposed. And we've run out of time, Tim. I guess it has to be. That's a really powerful point. And in fact, you marry that to what Sally said about making sure that the kind of scripts coming from the kind of people who are so underrepresented get properly looked at and then produced, and then factor in very deliberate attempts to bring people into the production process who would not ordinarily access it, and you get a little idea of what a more positive future could look like. Thank you, mate. It is 11. It's just coming out to 11:47.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Coming up later in the programme, we're going to look at Gary Lineker's comments about children not being taught how to cook and what it is actually like to reach adulthood without being able to cook. I think we are. There's still room for a lurch back towards the deeper end of our conversation, but we will almost certainly also be getting a proper explainer on South Africa's latest intervention at the International Court of Justice, where they are seeking an urgent order for Israel to end its current assault on Rafah, to halt its military action across the entire Gaza Strip, and to allow... This is the bit of the conversation that I always find most profound, actually, when I say allow international investigators and journalists into the territory. Because when you think about the importance of information and the efforts that Israel goes to prevent information from being sourced and therefore delivered by international investigators and journalists, and whatever other views you may have on this issue or the broader context of it, the question of why wouldn't you allow international investigators and journalists into the territory becomes arguably the most important question of all. This is a written request submitted by lawyers for South Africa, requesting judges to issue an emergency order stopping the offensive in southern Rafah, arguing that the suffering was now so intense that a total ceasefire was needed to get food, medicine and other aid to the population. And the reason why I want an expert, if you like, on this is because the bit of confusion last time around the question of genocide and plausibility, with an awful lot of the media, myself included, reporting that the finding of the court was that genocide in Gaza was plausible, whereas in fact, and you may think this is nuanced or hair-splitting, but it's important to be accurate on these things. In fact, it was found that the need to protect the Palestinian people from genocide could become plausible or was plausible. So it's a different proposition. It is plausible that genocide is being committed, is not the same as it is plausible that Palestinian people may need to be protected from genocide. And as I say, you may think that's a hair-splitting exercise. I disagree. Let's get back to the conversation about working class people just simply not getting into the creative arts. Mark speaks for lots of you when he says, that was brilliant from Sally Lindsay. You could have just switched the phone lines off, James, and let her talk for the rest of the show. You're not kidding. It was a joy to listen to. Get her on Full Disclosure pronto, and I will. I definitely will. But a quick word about Full Disclosure, which, as you know, is my sort of long interview project. It's at my podcast where I get to sit down with people for an hour. But what often happens, what I try to do with most but not all guests, is talk about the life before you knew who they were. And that's why it's particularly interesting when you speak to working class actors, because the journey that they have taken to success is going to be very, very different from the journey taken by people from different backgrounds. So as I say, it's Julie Hesmanhouse on last week's episode, and she really immersed herself in the world that Sally just described. And then when we get Sally on, her journey from a school where nobody would have expected you to sort of be an actor when you grow up, to being one of the best known actors in the country and a producer and writer of her own material. That's the bit that interests me the most. And that's why Full Disclosure is such a joy to do, because you find out the stuff you didn't know. It is 11:53. Let's get back to the conversation. Lewis is in Dunstable. Lewis, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James. Thank you ever so much for taking my call, and your wonderful team and producer as well.
Let's not get carried away, Lewis.
So I wanted to chat about, I didn't want to work in acting. I wanted to work more directing and working with children in creating projects in that form. And while I was at university, I had the freedom, both financially and freedom of time, to be able to work with my local theatre, which was in Northampton, on projects every day, most evenings. And I had all that availability to build those connections, build that standard of work
Why did you? Because you were subsidised by...
Yes,
by your...
I was subsidised by university. I had my maintenance loan. I had all of that freedom to do, and I worked on multiple projects and really put my heart and soul into them.
Right.
But the moment that university finished, all that financial freedom went. I needed to get a job to have a roof over my head, to stay in Northampton.
Yeah.
And the minute that happened, all my availability vanished. My ability to say yes to projects changed because I would have to then request time off from work, and I worked in retail, which then meant I had to organise with other people covering shifts.
Yeah.
And from that moment on...
It's the simplest thing, isn't it, Lewis? It's the simplest thing. And yet it really merits repetition, that if you can actually say, I'm available all the time, you move ahead of the person who says, I can't do Thursday, I've got to actually work, otherwise I won't be able to pay my rent this month.
Absolutely, and it became that sort of recurring thing. And there was a moment where I was called in very last minute. I had a weekend off to go and help a project, one of the major projects they were doing. I walked in and I was passed on to one of the directors from the National Theatre, and I was working with them. And it was a moment of, you've called me in last minute to come and help out the project because you've not got enough people. You've put me with one of the biggest people in the country for the theatre world.
Sliding door moment, isn't it?
And yet, because my availability wasn't there, and because the theatre at that point knew that I had to finance myself, that was the end of that. And after that point, projects became sporadic. I would have to take off holiday. I'd have to sacrifice finances just to work on projects where often they couldn't pay you, or it was only paying for sort of costing for things.
What are you doing now?
I work now teaching children drama and theatre for a company, and I absolutely love it. And what's really important, and why I think it really matters, is that I could connect to kids in a very different way. I had that kind of... I came from Luton. I say Luton, I really should say Luton. I had that connection. I really could make kids laugh.
Why does that matter? So why would you, and I'm fully prepared for you to be as rude as you like about me, but why would you, walking into that room with kids from a let's just say a working class background, because that's the phraseology in the study that they've done in Sheffield, why would you be able to provide something in that space that I, for example, couldn't provide?
I guess because I was much more gruff and ready. I had that ability to drop into slang. I didn't have that air of class about me. I would very much, in a sense, sort of get my hands dirty. And there's a phrase that I love repeating for the kids that I teach is, we created a safe space for dangerous things. And I think coming from a working class background, I love it. So much fun. Because I had
They believe you.
Absolutely, and they knew that also they were free with me. They could be cheeky with me. They could be sassier. They could be more rebellious because they knew that, do you know what you're going to do? Whatever you do, I'm going to be better than you. You're going to take a mickey out of me. I'll take the mickey out of you. And because they knew it was genuine, they knew that it was coming from a space where, they could say silly things about me. They could.
So it becomes self-replicating then, because some of the children that you work with may go on to succeed or work within the industry, but perhaps that they would be less likely to make that step if they hadn't had the benefit of your guidance earlier. So it becomes perpetuating this problem, which is why once the figure starts dropping, once the percentage of working class representation in the creative industry starts dropping, it's very hard to stop it because of that nature of you can't be what you can't see. Was it the Royal and Derngate where you were working as a kid?
It was, I worked.
I love that theatre.
It's a lovely theatre.
I love that. It's one of them. I did a national tour with the book, and I thought when I was a kid I wanted to be an actor, and obviously it was never going to happen. But that's the closest I've ever got, being backstage places like that, and seeing the props room, and that particular theatre though is an absolute jewel, isn't it, Lewis?
It is, and I worked backstage. I did lighting and sound for them.
A great vibe there as well. There seemed to be still a very good vibe there, albeit that it was just a gob on a stick on stage talking about his book rather than a proper production. I like the feeling of it.
And it was that sort of, I diversified and I worked with a friend on projects and we created he created his own theatre company and we toured it and we won awards. But it got to a point, even though we won multiple awards, we sold out shows, they got to a point where we couldn't continue to fund and pay for the project to carry on. And eventually you just run out of road, as you say, almost like when you're talking about the cost of living, you run out of money before you run out of month kind of thing. And that was the thing. He made everything ourselves. We sourced everything for free. And some of the highlights, I remember, just to sort of finish on a real high, I remember a father bringing his two sons to one of our shows and his son sat on opposite knees and you could see this poor dad sort of straining under the weight of these two kids, sat perfectly still for 40 minutes. And then once the show finished, the kids rushed forward to come and meet the puppets and the props we had. And I got to see this dad finally stretch his knees out, look at sort of that relief he had, but then look at him as his two kids were yelling, he said, come and meet them, Dad.
Oh, how exciting.
And it's just
it's magic. And those moments stay with you forever. Even if you haven't got in a million years, you're not going to go into the industry. You find stories that are relevant to you. Stories, sounding a little bit, if I may sound for a moment, a little bit dreamy. It's stories that set you free from the quotidian, from your daily life. It's why fascists hate the arts historically, because imagining what it is like to be somebody else teaches you empathy, and empathy teaches you to resist attempts to persecute based on immutable characteristics. Lewis, thank you. It's just gone 12 noon.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 4 minutes after 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This is a new one. How long have you been listening to this programme? Go on. How many times can we honestly say that we're going to have a conversation that we've never had before in any way, shape or form? Part of the problem with me doing this now is that you'll text me and you'll say, oh, actually, James, I think you'll find that you talked about that in 2018 or 2000 and how long have I been? Yeah, 2008. I go, no, I'm sure I haven't. We've talked about food. We've talked about children and food. We've talked about school dinners. We've talked about the importance of nutrition. We've talked about, in fact, the biggest sort of penny drop moment, the biggest kind of shock moment we've had in recent years was when we were talking about school dinners in other countries. I'm increasingly drawn to that, I don't know whether you've noticed. Asking what happens in other countries, just as a way of working out how we're getting on, or whether things are as bad as some of us fear, or whether things are actually a little bit better than perhaps we allow. So you look, well, what happens in other countries? I'll tell you the one we haven't done, which I thought about on Wednesday when we were talking about Mel Stride and Jeremy Hunt claiming that there's loads of jobs out there if you can just be bothered to look. What we haven't done is look at what sort of support you get when you lose your job in other countries. And some of the stuff that's come in unprompted about what other countries do to keep you buoyant and solvent while you go about the business of trying to find a new job commensurate with your old job. I mean, it was almost like the school dinners. We were talking about, if you weren't listening, we were talking about English school dinners, which seem to have lurched back in the direction of the turkey twizzler, despite the best efforts of Jamie Oliver and others. And parents in France first and then other countries started sending me pictures of the menu at their children's schools, or even pictures of their lunches. And the French in particular were like, 3-course meals when our kids are getting pizza and chips or something like that. And that must have an impact on pretty much every area of their life. But if the information I was receiving on Wednesday was correct, then the support you get when you're unemployed in other countries, notably I think Scandinavian countries, compared to what you get here, is I've been breathtaking. So we might get onto that one day. We're not getting onto it today. Well, we might get onto it today. Not that specific thing, but we might get onto a comparison. 2 stories in the news about children and food. The first, that they're being forced into unhealthy food choices at school because companies are pushing meal deals. Healthy lunches tend to cost more and have fewer options than the unhealthy meals. It's only 7 schools in the UK that have taken part in this research, but it shows that they tempt pupils to go for the grab-and-go options such as pizza rather than the more sustaining and nutritious meal, which I just touched upon by talking about a sense of lurching back towards the days of the turkey twizzler. But I love that the story that we're actually going to use as our way into this for a bunch of reasons, but chiefly because the Daily Mail has chosen to treat this story in such a pathetically predictable way that I thought I'd share it with you for the giggle value. So Gary Lineker has talked about how important it would be, how good it would be if children were taught more to cook at school. He says, I think that's the thing we fail our kids on. I think it should be an absolutely must learn at school. Now, why is he talking about food? Well, he's on a podcast with the owner of the River Cafe. He is literally on a podcast that talks about food. And he adds that they used to offer it all the time, meaning teaching children how to cook. And you can still do a bit of cooking at school, but it's a life school. He says you can be really passionate about it. Rather than making kids that aren't very good at maths learn maths, beyond your basics. Next thing after those two is cooking. It's the one thing we all do forever is eat. And guess how the Daily Mail report this? So Gary Lineker, once again, putting himself out there to speak up for people, in this case children, arguably less fortunate than him and his children, or children who need a bit of a voice, calling for, wait for it, the hugely controversial call from Gary Lineker for children to be taught how to cook. I mean, whatever next will the Prince of Woke inflict upon this country? Teaching children how... No, I'm joking. Well, except I'm not. So here is how the Daily Mail chooses to report Gary Lineker suggesting that it would be a good idea to teach children how to cook. Are you ready for this? Gary Lineker has hit out at the government once again. This time for not teaching children to cook at school. I read the quotes twice just to see whether or not he was actually hitting out at the government specifically. And, well, if he is, then for reasons beyond the wit of this man, the Daily Mail has chosen not to provide the proof of the claim that they make in the first paragraph of this article in the ensuing 7 paragraphs of this article. He does talk a bit to Ruth Rogers, the founder and owner of the River Cafe, which, seeing as we're knitting things together food-wise, is where Jamie Oliver was working when he was discovered by a camera crew and propelled to the subsequent fame and fortune which he has quite rightly enjoyed. He does actually get asked a bit about his criticisms of the government's asylum policy, but he hasn't brought the government into his call for children to be taught how to cook in school. But that doesn't prevent the Daily Mail from attacking him for attacking the government. Good God, sometimes it's really not hard to pick a side, is it? In one corner, you've got Grant Shapps, you've got all the rest of them, you've got Jeremy Hunt, you've got Mel Stride, you've got, I can't say honest Bob Jenrick anymore, he's resigned for reasons that I can't quite remember. Suella Braverman finally got handed her sandwiches in a roadmap by Rishi Sunak. And on the other side, you've got Gary, you pick a side. And yet, of course, huge parts of the country, huge swathes of the country are going to be tempted to get into bed with Grant Shapps instead of Gary Lineker. But what it made me think about, and both the producer Eleanor and I both enjoy cooking a lot, but I wasn't taught any cooking at school. I wasn't taught anything at all at school. So it's not a complete causation correlation. Most people these days are not taught at school, and yet it's not as if the entire population has forgotten how to cook. But you do hear when you are having these sort of conversations, you do hear, particularly the current #1 best-selling paperback in the country is Ultra Processed Food by Chris Van Tulloch. I mean, it's not like, as the author of the second best-selling paperback in the country for the last 2 weeks, it's not like I'm jealous or anything like that. I think it's great. So, yeah, it's really great that his book's doing so. It's fantastic, yeah. Ultra-processed food. But the reason why people sometimes resort to ultra-processed food, which, as Chris Van Tulloch's best-selling book explains in fantastic detail, is sometimes because they don't know any better. And not knowing better is not just about understanding nutrition and understanding what happens to food when it is processed. I think it's probably also about not being able and not being able or minded to cook for yourself. And what I don't want to do now is assemble a long queue of worthy virtue signalling people like me to talk about how much we love cooking and how important it is. I want to try to do a phone-in for people who don't cook. All right? I really hope this works. And it won't. unless you help me. And the question then becomes twofold, doesn't it? Why can't you cook? Can I speak to someone who actively doesn't like, you actively hate cooking? 0345 6060 973. Can I speak to you if you are a casualty of the failure, the cessation of teaching children how to cook in schools? So you were not taught how to cook in school and no one else taught you how to cook. And then you get to adulthood or you get to school leaving age, and either you have to sort of teach yourself, you have to sort of go on an autodidactic crash course, or you literally only heat stuff up. I mean, this is where there's a danger of it sounding snobby. Do you know the two things that annoy me most about false snobbery, fake snobbery, the two things that drive me potty, and actually Jamie Oliver is the perfect example of this. When people start talking about it being middle class as a pejorative, to do two things. One, to cook decent food, 0345 6060 973. I don't know why I said the number then. It was like a sort of Pavlov reflex, that. But the other is reading. So, I don't read books, it's so middle class. Don't be so stupid. Feed the mind with the books and feed the body with the food. If you are going to be objecting to either of those phenomena because you think that it's a bit fancy-schmancy or a bit middle class, then you are, forgive me, an absolute prune. Not to mention a plum. So I hate those two sort of lazy kickbacks against people like Jamie Oliver encouraging you to eat more food, or anybody encouraging you to read more. But it does open up the possibility of quite significant swathes of society, and particularly in this country, because this doesn't happen in other countries. This is a peculiarly British, probably American also, disease, where we've got a lot of people who can't cook, won't cook. And I just want to know what that's like. You might not think that you are interesting enough to contribute to a radio phone-in, but if you can't cook, I really want to know what you had for tea last night. What do you eat all day if you can't cook? So on the political side of things, why did we stop teaching cooking in school? Is it a bit of a shibboleth that we should be teaching children how to cook in school? Something that we all go, oh yes, that's definitely true. But actually it isn't. I think I've used the word shibboleth correctly. I very nearly used it incorrectly earlier this week. If I have used it incorrectly, one thing of which we can all be certain, someone will tell me, about 200 people will tell me in about 5 seconds' time. So why did we stop teaching cooking in school? All right, you can come at that from whatever angle you please. 0345 6060 973. But what is it like to be an adult who can't cook? That's all I want to know. I do not want a queue of smug middle-class people like me talking about how important it is to cook and how much I love it. If you're very good, I may give you a couple of my recipes towards the end of this hour, but given that one of them just involves sprouts and creamy blue cheese, you'll know that I'm not exactly Angela Hartnett, who also appeared on a recent full disclosure sounds amazing. I can't believe you don't listen to it already. So, adults who genuinely can't cook. A, how did it happen? 0345 6060 973. And B, what's it like? What is it actually like? I've got some friends, they'll kill me for telling you this, but hopefully they're not listening. I've got some friends who, I think it's worth mentioning that they're very well off. And I went round to theirs unexpectedly. I was dropping something off and they said, well, we'll be having our tea, but we're having our supper. We'll be having our supper, but do pop in anyway. Have a glass of wine. And so I thought, yeah, all right, I'll do that, because otherwise I'm going to have to make another detour later in the week. So I go round to theirs to drop something off. And do you know what they were having for dinner? They don't think I'm being a snob, because I'm not being a snob. These are very well-to-do people. And they were having for dinner French bread pizzas out of the freezer and oven chips. Now, I, in my life, have enjoyed French bread pizzas and oven chips on many, many occasions. But if Mrs. O'Brien and I were sitting down for dinner of an evening, we might have put a bit of salad with it, or you know, a French bread pizza, two ultra-processed food products straight out of the freezer. And I made some sort of comment about whether or not, you know, they were about to defrost the freezer and using up everything in it or something like that. And no one was offended, but they kind of ate like that every night. Neither of them could actually cook. Lawyers, actually. I don't know whether that's relevant to it at all. City lawyers, both of them. And neither of them could cook. So this isn't necessarily a class issue. It's a question about what's it like. How the hell did you end up not being able to cook? And if you can't cook, what do you do? 0345 6060 973. It's 12:18.
James O'Brien on LBC.
20 minutes after 12 is the time. It's alien. That's the thing. And when you're conveying something that is alien to you, you don't want to sound judgmental about the people that are the aliens. In this case, people who can't cook. It seems an extraordinary place to end up in the modern world. You can't turn the telly on without a cooking program. You can't release a best-selling book without getting spanked all over the charts by air fryers. But there are loads of people who can't cook, and it is Gary Lineker once again who gallops to the rescue of the population by pointing out it would be quite a good idea to teach children how to cook. But what happens if you never learn? Sama is in Wallington to kick things off. Sama, what made you pick up the phone?
I think this is quite an interesting topic.
Well, thank you very much. I've been doing this for 20 years, you know. I hope occasionally I get something right.
Yeah, it was. I absolutely despise cooking.
Go on.
I think when I was a child, I grew up on home-cooked food. So my mum was cook, and my older brother really enjoys cooking. But just the idea of going to cook, I absolutely hate. And I had to self-teach myself because I have 2 children. So I kind of just have to do it. But even then, I'm just like, oh, my God, I have to cook dinner. What am I going to do? I don't even know how to do it. I ask family members for help.
But you had a master class in your kitchen growing up for 18 years. You could have just sat at your mum's shoulder and learnt everything you need.
There was no need for me to do it because I had people cooking for me. So why on earth would I try that? And if I had people cooking for me, there was no reason.
If you've got a dog, Sama, you don't bark yourself, do you? Do you like food?
Yes, I'm such a foodie, but I just don't like cooking. It's awful.
So what's in your arsenal? What are your specialities now? I'm feeling. Forgive me. I hope this doesn't come out wrong, but I'm already feeling quite sorry for your children.
No, you know what? So I get satisfaction from cleaning. That's fine. But when it comes to cooking, no.
So what do you do? What are your specialities? What's on your list? What did you give the kids last night?
God, I think I went to my mum's last night.
All right, the night before then. We can do this for however long it takes, Sama.
Oh my gosh, please don't. You're embarrassing me.
Well, give me a vague idea. Come on.
I can make simple dishes like pasta and curries, I guess, just because I'm from like an Asian background.
Well, that's incredible. You don't need to be able to do anything else.
Yeah, but it's the thought of cooking.
How often do you cook a curry? I'm not letting you off the hook that easily. When's the last time you actually cooked a curry?
An actual curry.
An actual curry.
A month ago, maybe.
Oh, all right. I'll take that. But what is a typical meal for? And do you eat what the children eat? Do you eat the same meal, or do you do something again later?
I try to sit with them at the table because that's
so what's a typical meal? I'm not letting you go until you tell me what a typical meal is for the children on a typical day when you're really not into it, not on the rare occasions where you decide.
No judgment, right?
No judgment, mate. I promise.
God, like pasta dishes, probably.
Well, there's not. What's on the pasta? What's the sauce?
I'll try like tomato. And
so a tin of tomatoes, a tin of tomatoes, and a sprinkle of mozzarella.
Yeah,
that's
and maybe
nice.
Some chicken thrown in there.
You're fine. What are you talking about? This is not
kind of basic.
Yeah, I think you might be slightly gilded. And how often do they get something straight out of the freezer into the oven or the frying pan?
Do I have to answer that question?
Yeah, you see, because you're slightly not being completely honest with me, are you? That's the more normal. So like a frozen pizza or oven chips and fish fingers.
2-3 times a week.
Yeah, that's fine. But I think for mums, that's probably normal. There's no earthly way you can be knocking up an aligobi every night, not least because it takes ages. But
I think it's because I grew up with my mum cooking every day.
It's the fact that you hate it that's interesting. You associate it with something negative, even though you love eating the food.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. I hate it.
I salute your honesty, or at least however much honesty you have actually just brought to the programme. But nonetheless, I don't get it. It's such an odd thing, isn't it? To especially if you enjoy eating. You don't enjoy eating, then I could get it a little bit more. The chap we spoke to, I don't know if you heard it on Wednesday, that mad scientist. It's such a lovely bloke. The guy who was kind of responsible for discovering the gene, I think it's a gene, that leads to these weight loss drugs. I was doing a bit of research before I spoke to him, and he was talking about how they can actually remove your very enjoyment of food, these drugs. It's why they work so effectively. And I thought that would be like a prison sentence for me, taking a tablet that means you don't enjoy food as much as you used to. And he said himself you could only keep it up for a while because it ruins your life in some ways. But if you love food but you hate cooking, it's just a fascinating place to be in. Thank you, Sam. Ian's in Telford. Ian, what would you like to say?
Good afternoon, James.
Hello,
I'm
Ian.
45 years of age.
Well done.
And I can't cook, mate.
What, nothing at all?
I can pot noodle.
Yeah, that's not cooking.
I can rustle up now a spaghetti bolognese because my wife, I think, got that fed up with me. She stood over me and watched me and said, "It's simple. Even an idiot like you can do this."
Yes.
But
why do you think this is? Why did you reach your majority without really being able to cook anything? What did you eat when you were single?
I've never been single.
Oh, yeah, fair enough.
I haven't.
I believe you. It's like me and driving.
My mum did the business for me all my life, cooking-wise.
Yeah.
She would just produce this food, no questions asked. No, you need to come in and learn.
But you did, yes, exactly. But you never did.
No.
Well, you're not curious, man. Did you not think, "God, that's delicious. What's she done with this?"
No. And you know what? I'm a food snob, James, as well now. I've become, in my 30s, I've become an absolute food snob. And I love food, but the standing in the kitchen for an hour is probably the worst thing I could think of doing.
Does it intimidate you, the thought of having to get everything right at the same time and sprinkling this and timing that?
Yes, I did say to your producer, Sunday dinner, I find that amazing, how these women disappear into a kitchen and everything arrives on it. Okay, of course, sorry, yeah. And everything arrives on a plate.
In some ways, that's the biggest challenge. The same with the fry-up, actually, is getting lots of different constituent parts on the plate and ready at the same time. But and I can see why that would be intimidating. But are you proud of your spaghetti bolognese, Ian?
It's good.
And do you embellish it? Do you experiment with it? Do you think your spaghetti bolognese is nicer than your wife's spaghetti? It wouldn't beat mine. It wouldn't beat. 10 quid says it. Do you use chicken livers?
Okay, you got me there.
Yeah, there you go. Back here, get back in your box, pal. All right. Do you use pancetta?
You're too middle class for me.
It's not middle class, you see. That's what I was talking about. It's Italian. It's Italian peasant food. It's not peasant food. That would be a sort of putanesca. Have you ever tried a putanesca?
No, you're not even speaking my language now. We're on totally different pages.
It's Italian. It's such an easy thing to do, man. It's such an easy thing to do. Shall I tell you how to do it?
By all means.
Just put a tablespoon of oil in your pan.
Yes.
Right. 6 anchovies.
Okay.
Don't get put off by the anchovies. Melt them down. Let the anchovies melt. Just push them around a bit into the oil until they've actually melted into the oil. Lob in some garlic. You don't even need onions for this dish. Lob in some garlic, and then add some chopped up black olives.
Yeah.
Some capers.
Okay.
And a tin of tomatoes.
Yes.
If you want a few chili flakes, I would personally, but not everybody likes chili flakes.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. My wife's a big fan of chili flakes.
Well, you cook this for her tonight. And remember, you can rewind this on Global Player. You can pause and rewind this recipe on Global Player.
Yes. Okay.
Just let that simmer away for 15 minutes or so, and then serve it with spaghetti, and it will knock her socks off.
You know, up until probably 3 weeks ago, I didn't even know how to cook the spaghetti. I had to get her in to help me do that.
Well, you can read the box. A little glug of oil in the pan and plenty of salt in the water if you can. But just have a crack at that putanesca, mate. And it's a pleasure to cook that. And it's really quick and easy. It's all in one pan. You'll probably have to go out and buy anchovies and capers, and olives. But buy the olives in the packet, in the vacuum dried packet, so that you just need to give them a bit of a mush up. And that is a recipe that will start your weekend off with a bang, Ian.
Are you moving into cookbooks, James?
No, not yet, mate. No, not yet. I've got enough on that. Well, if you can't beat them, join them, mate. Seriously, see how it goes, because I feel that this is evangelical territory. A life without cooking, man, is like a life without reading. It's coming up to 12:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Tim Humphrey is here with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
Suggestions for my next book now include How They Broke Bread from Robin and How I Fed Britain by Alan. Listen, don't put oil in your cooking water. I never do, actually, but I always thought you were supposed to. So I said to Tim that he should. But no, don't. Lots of people have been in touch saying, no, God, no, don't do that, which I'm more than happy to spread around. But the rest of that recipe is absolutely sweet. And you can, as I say, use Global Player to rewind and pause and get all of the details absolutely correct. I tell you what, you can never accuse me of not moving effortlessly from the shallow end to the deep end of the news, and so we will pause temporarily our conversation about teaching children how to cook and what life would be like in the event of you never having learned, and turn our attention instead to recent events in The Hague, where, as I've mentioned to you a couple of times today, South Africa is asking the International Criminal Court for an emergency order to stop the continuing assault on Rafah. Sir Geoffrey Nice is a barrister who led the prosecution of the former president Slobodan Milosevic for war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal, and we're very grateful to him for finding some time to talk to us today. We should begin, if we may, Sir Geoffrey, with a sort of layman's guide to exactly what's happening, because even some of the best commentators in the world got a little confused about the relationship between plausibility and genocide during the last round of South Africa's case at the International Criminal Court. So in your own words, exactly what is happening here?
You need to kick off with this court deals with treaties and other agreements between nations. The Genocide Convention is an agreement between parties to that convention who agree that they will take steps immediately to stop any possible genocide and to punish it. That is the basis upon which South Africa, otherwise completely unconnected with the detail of the Israel-Gaza conflict, took steps, as it was entitled to do, if not even obliged to do in certain circumstances, to stop Israel committing any genocide it may have been committing, and to ensure that those who were entitled to the protection of the Genocide Convention, that is to say, in this case and this part of the conflict, the Gazan citizens, were protected from the risk of genocide. What the court decided, and this is where the problem arose in the short-circuiting that journalists and others made.
That's a great phrase.
What the journalists and others decided, what the court decided was not that there was a case, a plausible case, a reasonable case, or any other case of genocide, because that's something that can only be decided right at the end of the case when all the evidence on all sides is in. What it decided was, and it uses the word plausible that doesn't really appear elsewhere except in this category of International Court of Justice work, it decided there was a plausible case that the right of the Gazan people not to suffer genocide was at risk, possibly at irreparable or irreversible risk, but it was at risk. So because it found there was a risk that this group of people, Gazan citizens, might suffer genocide, then it took steps to ensure that their right not to suffer genocide was eliminated or reduced, and it made the orders that it did. And that's the only basis upon which it could act, and the only basis upon which it did act. And it's always been quite clear from the judgment that that's what it did. There's never been any ambiguity about it. But because it's not a criminal court, so it's not something with which most viewers and listeners will necessarily be familiar, it was easily understandable that people made a mistake and thought they were saying there was a plausible risk of genocide being committed. They didn't say that. They said there was a plausible risk that the right of the citizens not to suffer genocide was existed, and that ought to be stopped or impeded.
Yes.
And so where we are now, just to finish, in light of what's happened since and what has been threatened and is now apparently happening at Rafah, South Africa comes back and says, will you please strengthen the orders you've already made, because in light of what's happening, they say, all challenged by Israel, but in light of what they say has happened, the existing orders aren't strong enough. You must go further in order to save the Gazan people from the risk of genocide by ordering Israel to withdraw altogether.
Is there much precedent for this kind of case?
Yeah, there's plenty of precedent for provisional measures of this type built on the risk of genocide, including indeed in the Yugoslav case.
Yes.
But yes, there is. The more interesting is whether these orders have the immediate effect that the parties seeking them want. And there's not much precedent in that respect. That doesn't mean to say the orders are wholly toothless, because you and your listeners and viewers will have noted that the stronger position that South Africa has been advancing sort of has moved and is moving in parallel with the stronger concerns about the nature of the military operation in Gaza, and in particular now against Rafah, the stronger reaction that is coming from Western countries. So and who knows what the judges will decide, but if they decide to strengthen the orders at all, that will then add to the pressure coming, for example, from President Biden and others not to go ahead with the attack on Rafah, or not to go ahead with it on the same basis. And it was interesting that in a court that normally stays pretty well silent and just listens to submissions, just before the end of the last submission on behalf of the State of Israel, one of the judges asked that Israel provide, and the orders being made that it should provide within 24 hours, an account of humanitarian situation in a particular part of southern Gaza. Now, what that indicates, one doesn't know.
Sure.
But it may possibly forecast, I suppose, some kind of changed order dealing particularly with the provision of humanitarian aid. What's also, I think, interesting for trying to stand back and be objective, bearing in mind at all times that the attack on the 7th of October was unspeakably wicked, clearly criminal, and actually, for what it's worth, quite possibly genocidal on the part of some of those who were doing the attack. Standing back and trying to look at things as objectively as you can, you can't miss the fact that part of the basis upon which South Africa is advancing is the words spoken by people at high levels in Israel, as well as the level of damage being done, and advancing more clearly the argument that what Israel may be trying to do, or may have been trying to do, is to obliterate Gaza, really, or remove Gazans from Gaza. Now, again, the Western world has been sometimes less fierce in protection of Gazans than it might have been. But recently it certainly moved clearly in favor, as America has been specifically in saying, yes, no, the Gazans have got to stay there. There's no question of their being removed. That isn't going to happen. And so you may again find in step, if not in lockstep, but in step one with the other, the legal process at the ICJ, if it moves perhaps incrementally along the lines requested by South Africa, we find it in step with international public sentiment. That's a very long answer to explain how,
well, it's appreciated.
Although this order seems a bit strange to people who like to know things in black and white. There is genocide, there isn't, somebody's going to be punished, somebody's not. That's not what this court's about. But the orders it makes may seem academic only, but they're not, because they can have an effect.
Because the other element of the South African case is a call for international investigators and journalists to be allowed into Gaza by Israel. So in the absence of that, how can the court judge on some of the questions such as irreparable damage or the destruction of the sort of Palestinian ability? I think the phrase is the foundation of Palestinian life. If the court doesn't have its own people on the ground and the media and international investigators are denied access, what does the court rely on?
Well, it relies on what comes out to you, the journalists.
Who can't get in.
But you get some information out. There are still people broadcasting from Rafah. Of course, it's more difficult. And the fact that Israel won't allow people in to see what it's doing is possibly something that could be held against it. It's possibly something that can even be the basis of an inference adverse to Israel in due course. But setting that aside, you still got evidence. Now, we know that the number of those killed has always been challenged on the basis that Hamas figures might be artificially, purposefully high. And you will have heard the Israeli advocate this morning saying that even Okra, I think, has said that the figures are probably lower than has been asserted. So you've got to be cautious about the evidence you get. But if you get statements coming out of Israel, then they don't need any further reporting if they're reliably reported and verified. As to what happens on the ground, if you have a photograph of a mass grave with people with their hands tied behind their back or showing other signs of what happened to them before they were killed, consistent with it being a war crime, if you see a level of damage that is not to buildings, that doesn't, for example, in the opinion of a military expert, possibly justify what's happened, then that is evidence. In the same way as if somebody comes up to you and tells you, a witness, an ordinary person says, there I was standing in the street and I saw my family gunned down in front of me. You don't immediately say the person's lying. You say, crikey, probably telling the truth. Yes. But I do think that for commentating purposes, you may also, as well as being good enough to turn to me from time to time, you really also want to perhaps get the view of a really high-level military expert who can look at and give an explanation as to why what you're seeing may be beyond what is possibly justifiable as lawful warfare. I remember how very interested I was when I was in Gaza after the 2014 Operation Protective Edge. I could look at something with a sort of naive eye of a non-military person, but I had a very senior military person with me, and he opened my eyes to things that I was missing in both directions.
Yes.
In one case to say, oh no, I could easily see how that could happen, and it's not necessarily indicative of anything bad. On the other hand, I look at this and I can see for various reasons why this is unjustified. So I think you would do very well, if I may say so, also to try and get military experts in.
You certainly may. I shall get Eleanor to pick your brains actually when this interview is over, when you're no longer on air. But my final question, Sir Geoffrey, if I may, when would we expect the judgment to be delivered, and is there anything to stop Israel from completely ignoring it?
There's nothing to stop Israel completely ignoring, and it's ignored decisions of this court in the past in respect of the construction of the wall and the settlements. However, I think this court will decide very quickly. I would not be surprised if it's next week.
Okay.
And it must do that one way or the other, because it's being asked effectively to support by an order that it might make, if it chooses to make an order, the worldwide political pressures that, and I express no personal opinion, I'm just reflecting what's there, the worldwide pressures to not to attack Rafah or not to attack it in the way it's being attacked. So I would have thought very soon.
So, Geoffrey Nice, thank you. I know that was exactly what I was hoping for, and more. Barrister, as I explained, who led the prosecution of the former Serbian president Slobodan Milosevic for war crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal, and who will now hopefully be providing Eleanor with some suggestions of who we might talk to about the military perspectives that he just stressed the importance of. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The time now is 12:48.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:51. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Light and shade, they say. You've got to, if you do this for a living, you've got to provide light and shade. I don't think anyone could accuse us of not providing light and shade this hour. Fascinating explanations there from Sir Geoffrey Nice. But of course, I've got to give you a little taster of this week's Full Disclosure with the broadcaster and now author Zainab Badawi. That's a proper interview there. It really is fascinating stuff. But we're also still embarked upon a quest to find out what it's like if you can't cook. Phil's in Hexham. Phil, what's going on?
Disaster, basically. Complete disaster. While you were on air, I've been trying to cook some pasta out of a box. And I've got a nasty, slimy, orange mixture in the pan that one of the dogs won't even eat.
How often do you try to cook?
It depends whether you class as frying a burger and air frying some chips as cooking.
Air fryers, bloody everywhere, aren't they? Honestly, they're haunting me, Phil. They're haunting me. No, I mean, like, when's the last time you tried to cook pasta?
I'm not sure. I can't remember. A long time ago.
So you've reached. I won't inquire. I think you're in your 60s.
Yes.
Early 60s, and you can't cook at all. You can't really cook anything. You struggle with pasta. How did that happen? How have you managed to go so far with so little, if you don't mind me asking?
An amazing wife who cooks amazing food, and I'm self-employed and have to work every possible hour I can in front of the computer and don't really have time to do anything.
No, but that wasn't true when you were 18, was it? Or when you were 19, or when you were 20? I mean, you've done an entire shift without ever learning.
Too busy getting drunk in really.
I suppose that's valid.
And I was just saying that, when I was at school, you couldn't learn to cook. That was only for the girls.
What did you do? Woodwork?
I was rubbish at woodwork.
That wasn't a joke. I presume you did woodwork while the girls were doing domestic science, did you?
There was.
And you were rubbish at woodwork as well. I don't want to be rude, Phil, but there's a bit of a pattern emerging here.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do was learn how to type because computers had just started to come out, and I knew typing was going to be an important thing.
Oh, fair enough.
And once again, no, only girls type. Why do you want to type?
It's interesting, isn't it? It's so split down on gender terms back in the day. What did you do? Just very, very briefly, because I've got quite a lot to do before. I've probably even not got time for this. But was the water already boiling when you put the pasta in it?
Yeah, I followed the instructions on the box. Water,
and did you set a timer?
Margarine. I set a timer. That's right.
Oh, yeah, well, I can't. Maybe you I can't help you, Phil. Sorry. Even Jamie Oliver would struggle. I wish you well, though. I hope you enjoy whatever it is you have instead. Probably a sandwich. Thank you, Phil. It is 12:55. This week's guest on Full Disclosure is Zainab Badawi, who has written a book. It's already hit the bestsellers charts, An African History of Africa, which is such a powerful title because so much of African history has been written by people claiming to have discovered it. There's a superb comedian, I wish I could remember his name, but I'd never even thought of it properly before, but he'll turn up at somewhere like Stonehenge and pretend that he's discovered it and give it an African name. Because guess what? The Victoria Falls already had a name and were already known to exist before. Was it Livingstone? Was it Dr. Livingstone who claims to have discovered that? So all these Westerners who toured around Africa and elsewhere claiming to have discovered things. I was at school with a lad whose dad had a mountain named after him. And I remember thinking at the time, he was a sort of military cartographer. I remember thinking at the time, was there no one in that area before? Did they not have a name for that big hill? So that's why an African history of Africa was so important. And that is indeed one of the themes that Zainab and I talk about.
I was rather taken aback by the fact that even Africans themselves on the continent know very little about their history.
Yes.
I wandered around Lagos University and spoke to the brightest and the best in Nigeria, asked them what they knew about their history. They said, well, the slave coast was along our coast here. Nigeria was formed in 1914. And I said, anything else? And they sort of drew a blank, you know. And even my own mother, when I asked her about the pyramids in Sudan, she couldn't really tell you very much about the history. She'd seen them. But I do think that Africans themselves should understand that they have a marvellous history that predates the transatlantic slave trade.
Is that a consequence of colonialism? Is that an erasure?
I think it is partly a result of, as I said, the emphasis on post-colonial history by European writers, but also the most influential African diaspora in the world is the African-American diaspora. And they obviously arrived in the United States. Their ancestors did as enslaved people. And so I think when African Americans or Black Americans, some choose to call themselves that, start their history with slavery, and often they do.
Yes.
I think that reinforces the idea that the history of Africans begins with the transatlantic slave trade. And obviously you see in Hollywood and in, popular fiction, the slave narrative, the slavery narrative has very much dominated this, and there's much less, although this is changing a bit.
I was about to say this will change even more, because the book is full of amazing stories.
Well, I hope so. I mean, you already have seen Queen Njinga, who I've mentioned, the queen of the Ndongo, who lived in the 16th and 17th centuries in part of what's modern-day Angola. Her story was dramatised by Jada Pinkett Smith, and, on Netflix, half a dozen or so episodes, I think. So you are beginning to see that interest.
Zainab Badawi there on this week's Full Disclosure, talking, amongst other things, about her rather splendid new book, An African History of Africa. And that's it for another day. I think Phil may have been talking about something most of us didn't understand. There's quite a few of you who think that he'd got his pasta dish out of a packet as a sort of cheesy pasta dish that he was just simply seeking to heat up. So in some ways, the story was even sadder than those of us who thought he was failing to cook spaghetti fully appreciated. Still, Phil, I hope the dog finds room for it, even if you don't. And that is it from me for another day. If you missed any of today's show, you can, of course, listen back and pause and rewind on Global Player, which with my little recipe, it wasn't my recipe for spaghetti putanesca, it's the one I nicked off Nigella Lawson. But don't forget to reserve a little bit of pasta water in case you need to sort of loosen up the sauce after you've added the pasta to it. You can do all of that on Global Player, as well as download Full Disclosure. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thanks, Mary. I mean James.
James O'Brien on LBC.